Hello everybody, welcome to another entry in my series on interesting vehicles for younger enthusiasts. Today I am driving what I believe to be the first SEAT on the channel. I have experienced a few SEATs in the past, but for some reason or another it's a brand that I seem to continually overlook. And I can't be the only one. This car is a very close relation of the very well-known Golf GTI, the ever-popular Audi S3, and also the lesser-spotted Skoda Octavia VRS. The SEAT is, for all intents and purposes, a Golf GTI. It's got the same engine, basically the same MQB-derived chassis, many of the same inner gubbins, switchgear, and so on and so forth. But it's just a bit of a different look. However, there is a little bit more to it than that. You see, in Golfland, the GTI has quite a bit less firepower than its all-wheel drive bigger brother, the R. And in fact, thanks to the R's popularity, the Golf GTI is almost an endangered species these days. The SEAT has essentially the same power rating as the Golf R. In this particular car, 300 mighty Spanish horses, but it doesn't have the all-wheel drive system. This is exclusively a front-wheel drive car. It's also notably cheaper than the VW offerings. This car, even with very generous spec, has a list price of around about £33,000. Some of that spec includes things like this lovely panoramic roof. The more important number in terms of finance, though, is this. This car could be purchased for no deposit and less than £350 a month. Seeing as most people now buy their cars on finance, that is an incredible figure. That is seriously good value for money for a car that offers pretty mighty performance. But why don't we see so many of them? I don't know. I really don't. I think they're actually quite a good looking car. In fact, I'd say they're a better looking car than the Golf. And for a lot of people, they just see a SEAT as, well, it's a VW with a different badge on it. Yeah, that's a good thing. That means that you're getting VW quality, durability, reliability, and parts availability, but with much lower prices. And indeed, this car doesn't really seem to have been hobbled in the performance department. At many points in the past, the SEAT has been the fastest of its family in the entire VAG group. In fact, they have had several notable Nürburgring lap record holders. Today, I'm going to be doing a couple of things. First off, seeing just how well this car drives, and secondly, wondering whether it's the right car for a young enthusiast petrolhead to buy. Now, in the interests of full disclosure, I'm not really giving this car a very easy time of things, because I have just come out of the Audi RS6 that you may have already seen on the channel. That is a fire-breathing, all-wheel drive, £110,000, 4-litre V8 animal of a car. This thing costs a quarter of the price and has half the power. So it's going to be interesting to see just how it handles these kind of roads. In the SEAT's favour, these kind of roads should be much more suited to its talents. One thing that this car doesn't have, which in my mind is a little unfortunate, but we'll find out how big an issue it is a mechanical limited slip differential. This instead uses an electronic style differential, which will use braking and so on to achieve some form of sort of torque vectoring, although it's not true torque vectoring. However, personally, I always prefer a real limited slip diff. If for no other reason than, yes, for performance driving in the dry, the electronic ones do a very good job, but when you're trying to navigate around these lanes when they're covered in snow, there is no substitute for the real deal. Now, I've just been driving the car in comfort mode, and it's nice and pleasant and decent and easy to move around. So let's stick it straight into Cupra mode and see what she does. very brisk. Again, my senses have been somewhat warped by my time in the Audi this morning. Curiously, I'm just looking at this car's fuel and temperature gauges, and they are remarkably similar in style to that big old estate. It picks up pretty well, actually. This car, as you can probably tell, is equipped with the Dsg Gearbox. It's the earlier Dsg, so it's only a 6-speed item, but it changes gear pretty happily. It's got the ubiquitous Dsg fart, of which I'm not a fan. However, I must point out that this car's owner, Dan, has managed to keep it pretty damn standard. In fact, the only modifications are some visual ones. He's got a little extension at the front, some side bits, and a diffuser, which I think actually really complement the car. As a general rule, I'm not a big fan of white cars, but this actually does wear the colour fairly well indeed. Those gloss black extensions really then do stand out and give it just a little added edge. One of the things that's important to young people, or certainly was important to me when I was a young petrol head, is standing out a little bit. And because this car is an awful lot rarer than the VW or Audi variants, it does help it look just a little bit different when you're in a car park. This car is equipped with dynamic adaptive suspension. I've driven a few cars with it and a few cars without it, and generally speaking, the cars with it have never steered quite as well as those without. And it seems to be a similar case with this today. The steering isn't bad, but it's when you go to make those fine-tune adjustments, those little kind of mid-corner moves, that it just doesn't seem to respond that well. My theory has always been the fact that it is not simply different suspension settings, it is a continuously adapting system. So it's always trying to make its mind up as to what setting you want or what you want to be doing with it. And so whenever you go to lean on it, you're never really sure what it is that you're actually going to get out of it. I certainly have no complaints whatsoever about the gearbox though. It responds so well, and the engine does pull pretty hard. As with a lot of these things, it is quite a bit shorter geared than you might expect. As an example, my S2000, which, okay, it does rev to the moon and back, does actually do about 15 mile an hour more in third gear than this does. And considering the fact that this has an awful lot more torque than the Honda, that's a bit of a surprise. It's not a particularly light car. However, it does feel fairly sprightly. The suspension around town and at lower speeds in its stiffer mode is not very pleasant, but then of course it would be. That's what comfort mode is for. Even so, comfort mode is not perfect. It's decent, but not brilliant. However, I'm willing to overlook that because, well, it's just not the kind of car you buy if a nice luxurious ride is your priority. If you want to know a little bit more about the car, I'd suggest you check out its owner's YouTube channel. It runs a small little channel called Ride With Me, and I'll put a link in the description below so you can go and follow his exploits on there. He's doing it part-time at the moment, but go and give him a couple of views and some comments and some feedback, because I'm sure he'd appreciate it. And I know that this car is soon to be replaced with something very, very different indeed, and most unusual for a younger driver. Now let's continue looking at that topic of what's important for a younger driver. Well, I would say very high on the list is always going to be insurance. It's a pretty well-known fact that the Audi S3 and the Golf R are two of the most stolen cars in the country today. They are really, really quite bad for it. For whatever reason, the SEAT just doesn't seem to suffer from the same problem, or at least not to the same extent. Perhaps that's simply because it is so much rarer, there are fewer of them to get stolen, and therefore it just looks a bit better on paper. However, the important thing there is that insurance companies base all of their prices on statistics. And so the fact that far fewer of these get stolen means that they are much, much easier to insure for a younger person, or indeed anybody. I know several older people that have tried to buy Golf Rs or the like, and simply because they live in the wrong postcode, it's prohibitively expensive. Now, I'm not going to tell you what this car's owner pays for his insurance, because to be honest, it's pretty irrelevant. Unless you're him, you're not going to be able to get that same number. However, I can tell you that it's an impressively low figure, and even at 23 years of age, he's paying only 3 digits for his insurance. That is decent. I was paying, well, basically more than that for a much less impressive car at his age, so that's a real win for the SEAT. The Dsg paddles on the back of the wheel are unfortunately kind of cheapish plastic. The wheel itself is actually quite nice. I'm not a fan of the quality of the leather. The buttons are the familiar VAG ones, but it's about the right size and the right shape. I'd personally have it retrimmed in a slightly different kind of leather, but it's actually pretty good. If you like the wheel on a Golf, you're gonna like the wheel on this, put it that way. I do really love the wheel that Audi use. They're a slightly different setup, or they're certainly trimmed differently, and I am a big fan of Audi steering wheels. They just seem to get them quite right. The paddles, though, do have a very pleasing action to them, so you sort of know when you've pressed them, but I know for a car like this, I would like to see them a bit bigger, a bit chunkier, but in all fairness, I also criticised the R8 for the exact same thing. When you consider the fact that that is a £150,000 supercar and this is a 30 grand hot hatch, I think we can agree that that is a minor issue at best. Another negative with these cars, and is something that is again not specific to the SEAT, is the fuel economy. Around town, they're reasonably decent. They'll probably return in sort of mid-20s to high 20s, depending on your specific usage. However, it's on longer runs where they're really never quite as good as they should be. This, on its way up today, was driven mostly sort of on the edge of London, which is actually quite good for fuel economy, because if you can maintain speed, you're maintaining a relatively low speed, and yet it still only achieved about 34 to the gallon, which is not brilliant. It's not stunning. I've driven a few of these different types of cars. I drove a Skoda Superb, which granted is a bigger car with all-wheel drive, and I did 400 miles in that in eco mode and only achieved just shy of 33 to the gallon. So whatever it is that VW Group are doing with this engine, it's a lovely engine, but economy is not its strong point, and in fact it's, in my experience, no better than the old naturally aspirated 6-cylinder engines that BMW used to use, and those have a real character about them, which this one is lacking a little bit. However, let's now put it to the ultimate test and see how it does on my most demanding stretch of test road. The car is in full Cupra mode. The car's also displaying a screen down here with all sorts of information that I really shouldn't be paying attention to when I'm hustling a car, but it's probably great for impressing your friends in a car park and giving that sort of Nissan GTR vibe. I'm not sure whether I like or loathe the kind of carbon fibre-y, fabric leather type stuff that's on the edge of the seat. These seats are standard, by the way. Buckets are an option, but weren't available as an option when this car's owner bought it. Otherwise, he probably would have gone for them. And for a car like this, I probably would like a more supportive seat. But let's see how she does. It's pretty dry out there, and she follows the camber a little bit. It's that turning on the dead ahead is a little bit very vague. It just doesn't bite. The RS6 this morning actually impressed me much more in that regard. And it does turn well once it commits. And it'll pull you out of a corner nicely. A little bit of turbo lag, it's not too bad. It bounces you around a wee bit. It's actually softer than I kind of expected it to be. It rides quite well. It doesn't feel markedly different than the many Golfs that I've driven down here. The most impressive actually was a Golf equipped with a passive setup and aftermarket anti-roll bars and springs, and that to date is still one of the most impressive cars I've driven if you just want to hoon down a back road. This one is doing pretty well though, but the steering is just disconcertingly kind of distant. I mean, it's doing what I tell it to, but it just feels like there's an added layer of insulation between me and the road, and I think it's confirming my theory about the dynamic ride. However, in these conditions, the lack of all-wheel drive doesn't really seem to impede progress all that much. Cupra mode, I suspect, is probably loosening the reins of the traction control system, and I mean, you can certainly move down the road. The car's about the right size too. Those DSG farts wind me up because I keep thinking I've accidentally run one of my cameras over. That makes such a horrible noise. you want to impress your friends with it, it's good enough for that. Although, for a new driver, the concern that I would have is the fact that it just doesn't communicate what it's doing to you well enough. And this car has recently been shown with Michelin Pilot Sport 4S tyres, and they are some of the best you can buy for just all-round usability. Honestly, I know a lot of people really love Cups, but if you are going to drive your car in inclement weather, or certainly through winter, get the 4S. Honestly, seriously, they are fabulous. But look, this car does what it says on the tin. If what you really want is basically a Golf, but for a little less money, this is a great way to get that. If not having four-wheel drive does not bother you, save the money. Seriously, if someone came to me and said, I want a decent, fast, hot hatchback, this is a very good bet. Is it my favourite of the hot hatchbacks? No. I'm never really sure which car actually is. Each one tends to have its own strength, and very few of them have actually truly blown me away. When you consider the fact that this thing is about 20 grand cheaper than, say, an RS3, granted, the RS3 is in another league performance-wise, but in practice, if this is the kind of road you do your driving on, you're not going to notice a massive speed differential. I like the styling. You certainly can't say anything about the reliability. The car has been decent. In fact, in the 2 years that it's been owned, its sole quirk has been a slightly odd appetite for coolant, which has been checked a number of times and just seems to be a bit of a characteristic. The brakes work well. Everything in here is, again, standard VW, really. There's not much more I can say about it than that. If I did, I'd simply be repeating what I've said in previous reviews, and generally, it's a good thing. I mean, seriously, the Golf GTI is the benchmark in the sector, or certainly was for many, many, many years, and for very good reason. It's a very complete package, and crucially, if you're coming from something like a Fiesta ST, now honestly, this probably isn't that much quicker than a modded up Fiesta ST, but it does feel a lot more mature. It does feel like a more comprehensive car. It is slightly bigger, it's slightly nicer. I much prefer it over a Focus. I haven't driven the new Focus, but I've driven the old one. And if you're thinking about a Golf or an S3, try it, because seriously, they're not worth the extra money. Anyway, there we have it. That is the SEAT Leon Cupra. Hope you've enjoyed it, and if you have your own fast SEAT you'd like to see on the channel, or anything else really, please don't hesitate to get in touch at the usual address, which is in the description below. Thanks again to Dan for bringing it down to me. Please make sure to check his channel out. Please like, comment below, subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you all for the next one. Bye-bye.